Hello and welcome to the Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies podcast, where we showcase some of the latest research in the ethics of technology. I'm your host, Kristy, and today we will be talking to Dr. Lucie White, Assistant Professor of Practical Philosophy at the University of Utrecht. Welcome, Lucie.
Thank you for having me.
Lucie, today we will be talking about one of your articles on the COVID lockdown, or some of your articles, there's more than one. But just before we start, a little bit of background information. You did your PhD at the Australian National University. What did you do your PhD on?
I did my PhD on autonomy and research ethics.
Oh, interesting. I think we're going to circle back to that question of autonomy later on. And then you moved to Germany, halfway around the world, something I also did, to do a postdoc at the Leibniz University in Hanover. What were you working on there?
I was working on all sorts of stuff. So to start off with, mainly trying to expand my interest in autonomy to various other applied fields. So a lot of questions in medical ethics, medical technologies. And then more recently, I've been focusing mainly on questions to do with COVID.
Okay, interesting. And recently you also started working at Utrecht University. Was that in 2021 or when was that?
Yes, that's right, November 2021.
Okay, and you also, as part of your work at the University of Utrecht, you will also be a research fellow at the ESTED Consortium. So what will you be focusing on in that capacity?
Well, I've been thinking for quite a long time. I sort of put this on hold a bit with all the interesting stuff that's related to COVID to write about. But I've been thinking for a while about theories of autonomy. And often they're sort of designed with very theoretical concerns in mind, or they're designed really for classic questions in medical ethics. But it strikes me that there are sort of related concerns, particularly when we look at the new situations that come up with socially disruptive technologies. So they have something to do with autonomy, but traditional models of autonomy that are sort of designed for different contexts don't have really so much, I think, to say about these new situations. So what I'm hoping to do as part of my work in ESTED is to try to devise kind of a model of autonomy, or what I'm kind of interested in is getting back to the question, why do we value making our own decisions? And to apply this kind of new model to various socially disruptive technologies. I'm hoping this can tell us a bit more about the distinctive kinds of ethical questions that arise in these contexts.
Yeah, that seems like quite a relevant question to be asking within the consortium. Then just an obvious question that I ask all the guests, okay? Why this specific field? Why is this interesting? Why would you spend your life working on these kind of topics?
Well, I guess it was always really important to me. I loved philosophy instantly as soon as I started studying it. But I always wanted to do something that kind of was related to practical questions. And I got into research ethics because I really wanted to work with a particular supervisor, and he said I'd be interested in supervising something along the lines of research ethics. So I sort of got into that field in that way. But as I kind of continued on, I saw that there are a lot of really interesting practical questions to do with autonomy, particularly in medical contexts. And then I've expanded more recently into technological contexts. You need kind of, I think, theoretical answers to these questions, but they seem so obviously relevant to our actual everyday lives.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start talking a bit about your papers about the lockdown. Now, for many philosophers, these more theoretical, sometimes obscure kind of things is what we focus on, and we hope that the broader society will kind of get interested and listen to what we are saying. With a topic like lockdown, you're kind of jumping into such a heavily debated topic that I think anyone on the street would have some kind of opinion on. So what has the responses been on the article so far? Have you heard anything? Have you had any critique? What have people been saying when you tell them, "Oh, I'm researching lockdown"? What is the response usually?
When you just talk to sort of people on the street and tell them that you're researching really anything to do with COVID, the response is usually just, oh God, how can you be thinking about you? We have to think about this every day, all the time. How can you be working on these questions as well? But something that made me really want to pursue questions in this particular field is just that for this exact reason, that there's something that affects us so much that everyone's thinking about. They're so relevant to the kinds of decisions that are being made on a policy level, but also the kinds of questions that we're thinking about every day.
Yeah, that's a typical philosopher answer, like wanting to reflect on the things that we see around us every day. Now, I've definitely also gotten this idea that there's a COVID fatigue. People don't necessarily want to talk about it, but I think there's so much to talk about and so much that we can learn from the last, I want to say last year, because it feels like a year, because time kind of warped into this strain.
Absolutely.
So, but there's so much to unpack. So moving on to your article. So for the listeners, the main article we're discussing today is When is Lockdown Justified? That was published in the Journal for Philosophy of Medicine this year, actually. So if you want to read that, that is where you will find it. And you start the article by giving us an idea of what led up to the lockdown and what kind of information specifically the government in the UK had when they decided to impose a lockdown. Could you give us just a quick bit of a walkthrough on what the lead up was and what the main points was during that time?
Right. So we focused mainly in this article, I wrote this with two co-authors, on the situation in the UK. And what we were really interested in is this particular sort of quite distinctive situation we had right at the very beginning of the pandemic, when it seemed like we were in a very urgent situation that, as far as we could gauge, it seemed like action was required immediately, but we just had really quite limited information on the basis of which we could act. And, so there's this coupling of this sort of, it seemed like drastic measures were needed, but we also were just necessarily in this condition of severe uncertainty. Was, I think, a very interesting situation that might have also wider relevance to how we act under severe uncertainty. So, and we focused mainly on the UK because they really had just excellent documentation of exactly what kind of decision-making process they underwent. So they had this scientific advisory committee who were meeting quite frequently in this period, and you can really kind of track the types of information they were taking into account and what factors were really leading up to their initial decision to say, okay, no, we're really just going to need to impose a full lockdown. So there's been a lot of emphasis on how limited the information was. Some people say we really just didn't know anything at all. And I think it's right to stress that really we were very unsure about the evidence that we had at this very early stage. So we're thinking now sort of early March 2020. But we did have some information that gave us some sort of indication of what we might expect. So one thing that's really emphasized is we had epidemiological modeling. So models that suggested, look, it looks like the virus is spreading at this rate. Let's focus again on the UK. And, if it continues to spread at this rate, then hospital systems will be overwhelmed within this many weeks. If we implement this sort of policy measure, this is how much we can expect to slow the spread of the virus. This was a really key piece of information because it said, unless we really drastically limit people's contacts, which is really going to require all the sorts of measures that we saw, closing of schools and businesses, getting people to stay at home unless it was completely necessary to leave the house, we're just going to see our hospital systems overwhelmed. So it made a very sort of specific prediction. But that wasn't the only information we had. We had some empirical, but I should also emphasize very tentative information. We had some information coming out of China to suggest what the infection fatality rate of the virus was, or the infection hospitalization rate, so the amount of people who will die or need to be hospitalized as a result of contracting COVID. And that seemed to be a lot higher than the seasonal flu. So it's very difficult to pinpoint this number exactly. But we had some early indications, which seemed like this was sort of not just a normal flu situation. This might really require drastic action. Something that really spurred the UK into action was also seeing what was happening in Italy. So Italy, in some ways, is sort of quite similar to the UK, and they seem to just be sort of a few weeks ahead. And we could see there that hospital systems already were overwhelmed. So there was some empirical evidence to suggest that this was quite a serious threat, and we could expect hospital systems to be overwhelmed if action wasn't taken very quickly.
Yeah, what I found quite difficult when I was reading this article is to put myself back into the mindset of early pandemic days, because there was so much panic, there was so much information, and I mean, I think it's easy now when we look back to have this, hindsight idea of what could have been done. So that I found quite challenging to kind of put myself back into that period of time when it was so uncertain, and there was just a lot of panic in the public sphere as well. So that was an interesting kind of thinking back and thinking about, okay, we didn't know that much at the start of it. What you do say in your article is that when there is a lockdown, we need high epistemic standards to justify that lockdown, right? What does this mean, this idea of like the high epistemic standards that we need for the justification of a lockdown?
Right. So usually when we're trying to justify some sort of really severe imposition into people's lives, and particularly something as fundamental as restricting their liberty, we want to really be very, very sure that we have sufficient justification for doing this. And we're going to need a certain type of justification. So often, an analogy that's drawn is the kind of justification we would need to imprison someone who we suspect of committing some horrible crime. Even if we're sort of relatively sure, yeah, this person seems like they're out on a murdering spree, this isn't sufficient to lock them up. We want to make sure that kind of due process is followed, and we really meet this sort of high evidential standard in order to lock someone up. So we might think this is a similar situation here with lockdown. In order to restrict people's liberty in this way, we need to be similarly sure. But we actually want to challenge this normally very sensible sounding principle in this particular context. And it's really a compelling challenge to imposing lockdowns. We really need to be sure about this. And what we suggest is maybe different here. What might lead us to relax our very high epistemic standards in these particular cases is basically the opportunity costs of waiting and gathering further information. So normally we would say, okay, let's just, let's just pause for a second and let's get some additional information before we can get over this bar. In this case, we had sort of tentative emerging evidence to suggest if we waited any longer, if we tried to gather the information we would need to meet this high epistemic standard, basically our opportunity to act would have passed. We wouldn't be able to act at all anymore. So we suggest, even when this high epistemic bar is not met, as it wasn't, I think this is quite clear at the start of the pandemic, because we have some evidence to suggest that we need to act immediately, this might necessitate or sort of justify initially just, so we have the opportunity to gather more evidence and still act, imposing the measures on a very short-term basis, thus giving us the opportunity to sort of assess the situation, see what's going on, and see whether they're needed. And, because these are things that can be sort of relaxed or walked back later if we turn out to be wrong, this might be justifiable. Now, this is extremely tricky. We don't want to sort of license too much. We really want to be very careful about letting governments exercise really drastic powers like this. But we're trying to suggest, given this sort of extreme and very unique circumstance, this was justified in this case.
Yeah, and you did make mention of it in your paper, but this is very clearly the UK situation, right? I know
Right.
that in South Africa the discourse was quite different, where we had a younger population, we still have the AIDS pandemic that plays a big role, and tuberculosis and other kinds of things that we had to take in mind. So that's also what kind of makes this so difficult, is that you could look at other countries like Italy that's similar, but a specific country's demographics or specific situation really challenges what we can compare it to, and yeah, how we can try and project what might happen. So you also mentioned that the use of epidemiological models, right? Did these models not give us enough information to justify lockdown? Can you just tell us a little bit about what you mean with these epidemiological models, and whether can't they just be enough to justify lockdowns, you think, if the model predicts certain outcomes?
Well, I guess this really depends. So, what's really important with an epidemiological model is it needs to be fed with certain evidence. So, we need to make certain assumptions in order for the model to sort of make any projections. One is, how infectious the virus is, how many people, will be infected if we just let it spread very freely. Another is, what are the sort of demographics of the country? So I think this is really relevant to places like South Africa, right? If we could already tell at a very early stage that COVID really affected people very differently based on age. And this is one of the reasons that it hit Italy very hard, because they have sort of an older demographic in their population. So this should make us very cautious about sort of extrapolating assumptions to different contexts. And another thing which I think is very relevant to kind of this difference between, for example, England and South Africa, is what kind of effects policy measures will have. So basically, what this kind of model that really precipitated the decision in the UK looks at is different kinds of policy measures. And they have to make estimates here as well. If we close schools, the amount of people that will come into contact with each other will decrease by this amount. If everyone's staying at home, the amount of contact between family members will increase by this amount. So they have to make all these really specific assumptions that are set up, which are really based on how a specific society works. And, if the kind of conditions that people are living in are different, if the family structure is different, these things might be really different as well. So there are sort of 2 points that I want to make here. One is problems with extrapolation, taking a certain set of assumptions that are designed for the UK and applying them to a different place that might be quite different. But the other is, we do need some evidence to feed these models with. If we just sort of feed in random guesses, then they're not going to produce sort of reliable predictions. We did have some evidence that was sort of, if we're looking again at the UK context, relevant to what we would see in the UK. Again, this was highly uncertain, so we couldn't pinpoint estimate the exact infection fatality rate. We couldn't tell with pinpoint accuracy how, what kind of effect closing schools would have on the amount of people that have contact. I mean, it might just be that children are meeting in other areas and then we see spread this way. So because this was so unprecedented, it was very difficult to tell. So the epidemiological models can tell us something, I think, depending on how good the information we're feeding them with is. We do need to know that this is reliable to a certain degree, but probably, especially in these circumstances, they'll never be able to give us exactly accurate numbers about this many people will die under these conditions. They might be able to give us sort of a general sense of how serious the trajectory of the pandemic is and what kind of measures might be required, what really is just going to be insufficient and what might have a chance of working. So I think we can draw tentative evidence from these models, and the models are only as good as the sort of data that you're inputting into them. but probably we need to have a really good sense of what we can draw from the models and what we can't. So coming up with really, really precise predictions, especially in these circumstances, is probably just beyond what the models can provide us with.
Okay. So this might be quite a silly question that I'm going to ask you now from this privileged position of hindsight. But now that we have, more specific details about the fatality rates and, what we could have expected in hindsight, do you still think that the lockdowns were justified? Do you?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question. So I think something that was really important to us when we were writing about justification in this article is to not sort of take an omniscient, all things considered hindsight approach. I mean, when we're looking at a decision like, should we implement this policy under these conditions of uncertainty, we really need to sort of make the judgment based on partial and uncertain information. I mean, we can certainly make the claim, this is not sufficient to make the decision, we need to gather more information. But it's difficult, I think, to look back with hindsight and then really apply sort of information we have afterwards, even if it would say, this was kind of the right decision at the time. It's not so relevant to when we face this sort of decision and need to make the decision with partial information. I think something that was really interesting, there was an epidemiologist, John Ioannidis, who was very skeptical about all the hype around how dangerous COVID was and the need for lockdown measures. But he really suggested, look, right at the start of the pandemic, where we really had no idea what was going on, we had some indication this looked like it could be serious, but we just weren't sure. I mean, he would really say this turned out to be, overhyped. In the end, COVID wasn't as dangerous as we thought. We should all just calm down. This makes lockdowns less justifiable. But right at the beginning, when we weren't really sure about this, we were justified in implementing the measures. So I think this suggests, given the uncertainty, when we can't be completely sure about what will result, this can make things justifiable. Whereas gathering more information, it changes the calculus, it changes the way we make the decision, but it won't necessarily affect the justifiability of the decision in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's also quite interesting is exactly because there was that uncertainty, I think there was so much pressure on, getting a vaccine and focusing resources on specific places. So that's what I'm saying. I think it's a bit of a silly question, but it's interesting to think back on, should we ever encounter this kind of situation again? What have we learned about this, making these decisions under such uncertain circumstances? So yeah, it's kind of it's an interesting kind of trying to situate yourself between the things that we didn't know and what we know now. And also for me, it's also this question of was COVID maybe not as it was obviously very serious, but maybe it wasn't as serious as we predicted, exactly because we had taken those measures. So it's always this kind of, how do you determine outcomes in which you already kind of made specific decisions. Now, another thing I wanted to talk to you about. I remember also there was a time when contact tracing apps were hailed as this, this is going to definitely help us and this is going to make everything better. Like there was obviously a lot of issues with privacy, but there was a time in contact tracing apps that people really believed that this is one of the ways out of the pandemic. Why do you think it didn't play as big a role as we initially anticipated?
Right, so I think there are a couple of factors here. Yeah, it's really interesting. So there are sort of different questions that you can look at with the pandemic. I think this stuff about lockdowns, and you see a lot of philosophers doing this kind of, almost in a sense, post-pandemic work, where they're trying to draw out sort of general lessons. And, if we're looking at lockdowns, we might be able to draw out, general principles about acting under uncertainty and the conditions under which this is justified. The work I did on contact tracing apps was really early in the pandemic, and this was more sort of classical applied ethics work that you have this problem that we're facing right now, and you need to really quickly come out and say, we should do this or we should do that. And I think this is right. If we cast our minds right back to the very beginning, sort of April 2020, we were in lockdown. We were trying to work out how to emerge safely. So really, allow us to not be plunged back into another lockdown. We know that this just didn't work in hindsight. And people were really talking about contact tracing apps. This is going to be the answer. We can pinpoint who might be infected. We can lock them down selectively, and everyone else can just sort of go about their daily business. And the idea that this could be our answer faded quite quickly. Within a couple of months, people had really turned away from this. And I think there were two sort of big challenges. One was about how many people would have needed to use the apps for them to be effective in the way that people were sort of initially thinking they might be effective. We really would have needed pretty much everyone with a smartphone to be using these apps. So unless you wanted to come in, with really drastic sort of mandatory app use, it's very hard to see how this would have been achieved. So that's one problem. The other was the kind of app that people had in mind, I think, that the policymakers had in mind when they were really saying, this is the answer, this is going to stop the spread of COVID, this is going to keep R under 1. They were thinking about an app that basically could on its own sort of detect clusters of infection, and it could sort of alert people of exposure. It could then come back and say, oh, actually, no, that's wrong. Not enough people connected to you are infected. So actually you can go free. So it could release people very quickly and automatically. It could sort of pick up on 2 links of distance. So someone, has been potentially exposed that you just interacted with. So not waiting until someone's infected and then alerting the next sort of group of people, really being able to sort of look a couple of steps in advance. The apps that were actually rolled out in pretty much every country weren't able to do these things, because doing these things would have necessitated collecting some information and storing it about who has been in contact with whom, and this was seen as too much of a threat to privacy. So basically, what would have allowed the app to act a lot more quickly and efficiently, and it was very important that it was able to act quickly because people become infectious so soon after they were infected by COVID. This was ruled out due to privacy constraints, and this basically made it impossible for the app to function in the way that people initially hoped it would function in.
Yeah, the app was an interesting time. Once when I flew back to South Africa, even though it wasn't mandatory for me to disembark, I had to show that I had the app on my phone, the South African app. That might have been for a week. The rules changed a lot. And I was wondering when I got that app, the South African COVID app, I know it's different in different countries, but it also, like, there was also a measure of uncertainty. I got the app and then I would get a notification that I was exposed to someone, even though I didn't really go out of the house for 2 weeks. So do you think these apps also affected behavior, or could affect behavior as much as we would hope? Or do you think, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and another thing that would have been completely essential for the app to work, right? Like with any sort of COVID policy, sometimes we think about just, oh, we implement this and then just everyone will comply with it. And especially with the app, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. You could have people sort of saying, oh, I have an alert, but I'm sure it's fine, and this would have really required a lot of sort of adherence. We would have needed people to see the alerts and then instantly say, okay, I'm dropping everything, going and I'm quarantining myself. Obviously, this is also contingent on the idea that they can do this, that their employers would be fine with it, that they would continue to be paid. So we really would have needed people to sort of adhere to it in a very drastic way. It's hard for me to tell how either people sort of did actually react or change their behavior on the basis of COVID apps, or how they would have if the app sort of showed more promise. Especially this first question is probably more kind of a behavioral science question, but I think it is really essential to note this, because if this hadn't worked with extremely high adherence, as well as everyone having the app, everyone following the recommendations of the app, this strategy also would have just independently fallen apart. So there are a lot of things that needed to come together for this to work well. At the same time, a lot of people I've heard say no one would ever do that. You couldn't possibly expect people to follow this app to this degree. We're just not going to see compliance. But there are a lot of things that I think pre-pandemic we wouldn't have thought were possible. People really did, particularly in the initial months, pull together. There were very high adherence to various sorts of restrictions. So I think, maybe this could have worked. Definitely, it's right to sort of question this and think carefully about whether this could really work effectively. But I don't think we could completely rule out that people, if this really looked to be an effective strategy, might have complied in the sort of high rates that we would have required.
Okay. We're getting to the end of the podcast now, but one final question, and I know this is quite a big question for a final question. You said at the beginning when we started talking, you will be working on autonomy, right? And also on autonomy and how new technologies are kind of challenging, if I understand the concepts of autonomy that we already have. Can you explain a bit more what you will be focusing on, and what do you mean with what will you be looking at if you look at health apps or other technologies that might be challenging our views of autonomy?
Right. So exactly. So I've just sort of begun to think about this, and particularly in the context of health apps. So what strikes me, I come, from a background in medical ethics, and there's a very popular model of autonomy in medical ethics, which basically says, okay, when we're trying to work out if someone's autonomous, we should look at do they understand what they're doing, and are they being subjected to controlling influences? So when we think about a health app on our phone that's prompting us to do certain things like run this amount of time per day or drink this much water per day, we could take this sort of popular practical model of autonomy and we could apply it to this situation to see if people are autonomous. Do they understand what they're doing, and are they being subject to controlling influences? And I think in these cases, this model probably doesn't really get to the heart of the issues we might have with these sorts of health apps. So first, what do people really need to understand? Do they just need to understand, what the app is designed to prompt us to do? Do they need to understand more about the inner workings of the app? I think this is not completely clear without some sort of additional specification. Also, the notion of controlling influence, I think, is particularly difficult here, because in one way the app sort of is influencing us, but it's not really clear, is this sort of a problematic type of influence, or is it just really kind of helping us achieve our own self-chosen goals? So what I think might be a more fruitful way of getting to the heart of potential problems with these sorts of apps and conducting some sort of ethical evaluation of them is to think about why we value making our decisions ourselves. And a huge part of this is just that our decisions can kind of, in an effective way, kind of allow us to achieve our own goals. And so we can evaluate apps on this basis. If I'm really aiming to drink a certain amount of water per day, and I download the app and it gives me prompts, this might be sort of facilitating. In a way, I might just forget to drink the water. So this might actually sort of enhance the value of my choice by better allowing me to achieve my own goals. But there are other reasons that we value making decisions which aren't just sort of instrumental in this way. So, for example, say I want to lose a lot of weight. And there are kind of, there are two things that I might have in mind here once I successfully lose the weight. The first is just, achieving this goal. So I have this kind of instrumental desire to lose the weight. But it might also be that if I can successfully lose the weight by myself, this really shows something about my character, that I have discipline and I'm able to sort of act in this, certain manner. And it might be kind of different if I'm doing this with the assistance of an app. So it might lead me to my goals in the same way, but I might no longer be able to say that this sort of expresses something that I want to show about my personality, that I'm this sort of disciplined and self-controlled person that's good at sort of setting intentions and achieving my goals. So there might be kind of an aspect there. Basically, this is what we might refer to as the representative value of choice, that this choice prompted by an app can no longer represent something about me specifically and my character. And there might be kind of a paternalistic element to these apps too, which I don't think are well captured if we think about this sort of traditional medical model of autonomy. That if an app treats us like we're not capable of making our own decisions, that we really need to sort of be prompted into making healthy decisions, it seems like this might be experienced as kind of disrespectful. Usually it's very important in our society to just be seen as agents who sort of have this decision-making competence, that we're adults and we should be able to make our own decisions. So I might refer to this as the symbolic value of choice. And this might be undermined as well by apps that are sort of basically treating us like we're children and we can't make our own decisions about our own health. So those are just some examples. There are various other ways that we might think that we value making our own decisions. But I think maybe taking this kind of lens, really getting back to this question of why do we value making our own decisions, rather than looking at sort of ideas of autonomy that are constructed for different purposes, might help us to basically identify the various things that apps can help us to do, so the ways in which they might be advantageous and the potential problems that they throw up. And then we have to weigh these various sort of advantages and disadvantages. But I think this might give us a good way of identifying them.
Yeah, there's so many questions and comments I have about that. But just briefly, in South Africa, we have quite a large, I would maybe call it a nudging platform or an app that you can use for training and running. And it's been very successful. And I also used it. And it was also sometimes these conflicting things of when I go for a run, I'm like, okay, am I doing this because I can win stuff? Because the app was also a little bit gamified. And it was quite interesting when I moved to the Netherlands and I didn't have like this gamified app and all my friends and I were getting points together. Yeah, it became a bit more difficult to kind of achieve those goals that I kind of started assuming were my own goals. And then when I didn't use the app anymore, it started becoming, this question of, okay, but like how did this app kind of get me into these behaviors so thoroughly? So yeah, a very interesting topic that I will definitely be following the next couple of years as you progress on that. Any other interesting upcoming projects or anything you're looking at for the next couple of months?
My next goal, so I'm trying to pivot a little bit away from COVID, but it's just so difficult because there are so many interesting questions there. The thing that I'm working on right at the moment are two kinds of I guess you could call them sort of lessons of the pandemic. So one is looking again at this idea of acting under uncertainty, looking at the idea of precautionary principle, whether precautionary reasoning could have justified going into lockdown, how we could formulate a precautionary principle that might be useful in these kinds of contexts where there are really high stakes on either side. And we're hoping this can tell us something also about how to formulate a precautionary principle that might be useful in instances of climate change, for example, climate change policy, and maybe could also have implications for implementation of certain technologies. So something, drawing something from the pandemic that maybe can give us some sort of theoretical tool that might be useful in a wider context. I'm also looking at ideas about causation, how we view this in a very theoretical way, and how we view this in public policy and whether there are differences. So again, looking at the specific situation of the pandemic to draw out how we understand causation when we're trying to formulate public policy and what role this plays.
Okay, quite interesting. Quite a lot of topics that you're working on. Thank you once again for joining us today. To our listeners, once again, we spoke to Dr. Lucie White from the University of Utrecht, and you can follow her article. The article we looked at today was "When is Lockdown Justified?" in the Philosophy of Medicine journal. Thank you for joining us, Lucie, and thank you to our listeners. Until next time. Bye bye.